Hey everyone, it's Professor Clark, and now we are going to jump into participles. But before we get going, I should warn you that someone down the street is trimming trees or something. So if you hear some chainsaw sounds in the background, that's what's going on. It's not a serial killer, as far as I know. It's just someone cutting up some firewood or something. Hopefully, I'll be able to edit it out in post-production, but if not, rest assured, it's probably not a chainsaw killer. It's just someone using a chainsaw. So, with that in mind, let's talk about present active participles. Before we talk about present active participles, let's talk about what participles are in general, because you may not know. You may be wondering, what the heck are these participle things that you keep talking about, Professor Clark? So, in a nutshell, participles are adjectives that are formed out of verbs. We take verbs and we slap adjective endings on them, and then we have adjectives that have that meaning of the original verb, but act like adjectives. In English, we do use them. We may not know that we're using them because they don't have the same kind of fancy endings that they do in Russian, but we do use them. In Russian, they use them much, much, much more. So they are very widely used in written Russian. In spoken Russian, который clauses are more common, which is why you want to know how to use your который clauses really well. So if you're just chatting casually in Russian, you're probably going to use a который clause a lot of the time, although there are also many participles that have just become kind of standard words, standard adjectives, or substantive adjectives that have the meaning of nouns, and we just use them all the time and don't think about them as participles. But for the most part, in spoken Russian, we're going to use a который clause instead of a participle, but in written Russian, you're going to use a participle instead of a который clause. So in order to read and write Russian, you need to be able to at least recognize participles. And you may not be intending to do any writing in Russian that would use participles. Participles are most commonly used in things like academic writing and journalistic writing, where they're very, 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 very common. And you may not be planning to write any major articles in Russian in the immediate future, but you might be wanting to read articles. You might be wanting to read the news or read something in a journal. You might want to start using Russian in a more meaningful way, as far as reading scientific articles or news articles or just anything like that. In which case, you're going to need to understand participles because that's what they use in written Russian instead of который clauses. So, participles have regular adjective endings. So once again, there's nothing tricky as long as you know all your adjective endings. Some of them, and you'll see which ones as we go through the different kinds of participles, some of them will have regular hard stem endings and some of them will have regular husher stem endings. But in either case, they will be regular adjective endings, and there's nothing difficult about that as long as you already know your endings. Russian has 4 types of participles, and we're going to go through them one by one. So there are present active participles, and these are participles that refer to the one doing something, like the man walking the dog. There are past active participles, which refers to the one who did something in the past, like the man who walked the dog. In Russian, you could do that with a participle instead of a который clause. Present passive participles, so it refers to the one receiving the action, like the book that is being read, or the person who is being seen, or something like that. And then past passive participles refers to the one who received the action, so something like made in China. If you had that sentence made in China in Russian, that would be a past passive participle. So with that in mind, let's move forward and start looking at present active participles. Present active participles, so participles refer to the one currently doing the action, are formed from imperfective verbs. Obviously, they have to be imperfective because they are present tense. So things like читать, говорить, or идти. And present active participles can be formed from either transitive verbs like читать, писать, видеть, or смотреть, or intransitive verbs like идти or заниматься. So remember, transitive verbs are verbs that take a direct object, as in я вижу человека, I see the person. Я читаю книгу, I read the book. It has a direct object, which is in the accusative case. Intransitive verbs are verbs that cannot take a direct object. So for instance, идти, to go, doesn't normally take a direct object. So you say, for example, я иду по улице, I'm walking down the street. There's no direct object. Or a reflexive verb like заниматься can never take a direct object because the direct object is ся, the particle ся. However, it can easily become a present active participle, as can идти. So again, either transitive or intransitive verbs can become present active participles. And present active participles refer to the subject of the verb. If they are changed to который clauses, and all participial clauses can be changed to который clauses, который will be in the nominative. So let's look at an example. Занимающиеся в библиотеке студенты, where занимающиеся is the present active participle, means the same thing as студенты, которые занимаются в библиотеке. Either way, it means students who were studying or doing homework in the library. And note that который there is the subject of the verb заниматься, and it is in the nominative. So how do we form present active participles? Step 1. We find the они form of the verb. For example, писать пишут, смотреть смотрят, идти идут, видеть видят. Then, step 2, we remove the final та. So пишут becomes пишу, смотрят becomes смотря, идут becomes иду, and видят becomes видя. And then we add ша, that's the long ша with a tail, plus an adjectival ending. So пишущий, смотрящий, идущий, видящий. And so you know there we have пишу plus щи, смотря plus щи, иду plus щи, and видя plus щи. And now we've turned those verbs into a present active participle, which means the person who is doing that thing, the person who is writing, the person who is looking, the person who is walking, or the person who is seeing. If you were paying attention in that last slide, you might have noticed something funny with the stress. So the stress in present active participles is a little bit weird. It is different for first conjugation and second conjugation verbs. So first conjugation verbs like читать, the stress in the participle is going to have the same stress as the они form. So читать, читают, читающий. The stress is fixed on the verb form, and so the stress is also fixed on the in the participial form. Читать, читают, читающий. However, писать has a shifting stress. So писать becomes они пишут, and then the participial form is пишущий, with the stress on the first syllable just as it is in the они form of the conjugated verb. However, with second conjugation verbs, the stress is normally the same as it is in the infinitive. So if we look at смотреть, that becomes они смотрят, but the participial form is смотрящий. So смотреть, смотрят, смотрящий. The stress is the same as it is in the infinitive, not in the они form of the conjugated verb. However, there's a big exception, and that is the verb любить, which is second conjugation, shifting stress, and it becomes они любят. And then the participial form is любящий, with the stress on the you just as it is in the они form. So that's the major exception, but in general, first conjugation verbs have the stress the same as it is in the conjugated form. So писать, пишут, пишущий, and second conjugation verbs generally have the stress the same as it is in the infinitive. So смотреть, смотрит, смотрящий. And then you might be wondering, What happens when we form a present active participle out of a reflexive verb? Because remember, present active participles can be formed from both transitive and intransitive verbs, including reflexive verbs. When we form a participle from a reflexive verb, the reflexive particle sia is added to the adjectival ending, and sia always remains sia in all forms, regardless of whether it is preceded by a consonant or a vowel. So remember, if you're using it with a conjugated verb, it is sia after a consonant and semjachiznak after a vowel. So if we look at the verb zanimatsa, it has ja zanimayus with semjachiznak because the reflexive particle is preceded by a vowel, but the zanimayashya with se ja because the reflexive particle is preceded by a consonant. However, if you're forming a participle from a reflexive verb, you're always going to add sya, regardless of what kind of sound comes before it. So, for instance, we have занимающиеся, учащиеся, находящиеся. Note that in all three participles, we have a vowel, ye, before the reflexive particle, but we still write it and say it as ся. Also, note the stress in the second conjugation verbs. So, учиться, они учатся, but учащиеся. Находиться, они находятся, but находящиеся. So that is how we form a present active participle from a reflexive verb. To finish off, let's look at some examples. So, for instance, студенты, учащиеся в этом университете, means the same thing as студенты, которые учатся в этом университете. Students who study in this university or the students studying at this university. Занимающиеся в библиотеке студенты means the same thing as студенты, которые занимаются в библиотеке. Either way, it means the students who are doing their homework in the library or students doing their homework in the library. Or we could have общежитие, находящееся недалеко от библиотеки, which means the same thing as общежитие, которое находится недалеко от библиотеки. The dormitory that is located not far from the library, or the dormitory located close to the library. Either way, it means basically the same thing. However, note that participles match the noun they modify or refer to in gender and case. So который matches the noun that it refers to in gender, but it takes the case of its own clause. However, participles take both the gender and the case from the noun that they refer to. So, for instance, передай это студенту, занимающемуся в библиотеке. Студенту is dative, and занимающемуся is also dative. Compare this to передай это студенту, который занимается в библиотеке. Pass this on to the student who's doing homework in the library. In that case, студенту is dative, but который is nominative. These both mean the same thing, but notice the slight difference in grammar between занимающемуся and который занимается. So there we have it. That might seem like a lot. Don't worry, the participial system is kind of complex, but it's actually very regular and therefore easy to learn. The best way to learn it is, of course, to read, and the textbook has some really good readings that you can start going over to get a grip on how participles are used and see some common ways in which participles are used in standard written Russian. So I hope you found that helpful, and we will come back next time to talk more about participles.